But also, and coming on to defence, we pressed him also why it is that the Red Book, we should look out for the detail of the budget, showed a decline of about £300 million on capital spending on defence. And I did ask him, does that mean you're not going to get anywhere near hitting the 2.5% of GDP target for defence spending? Here's what we had to say.
We will need to spend more on defence. The world is a very volatile and dangerous place. Britain has a very special global vocation. Alongside America, we're one of the two countries that have done more than anyone else to maintain peace and security since the Second World War.
2.5% of GDP is
we've said that we want to increase it to 2.5% of GDP as soon as it's economically possible to do so. But there's a lot of things we have to work out, in particular what we would spend any extra money on. If you look at the war in Ukraine, you can see that drones have become incredibly important. So we need to do that. We need to reform our defence procurement, which is not working in the way it does. But we recognise that this is a world in which we're going to spend more on defence.
Yeah, Jeremy Hunt there, not saying how much more he wants to spend. Now, Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, has been called to give evidence to the Defence Committee, which is away from that, the UK at the moment. They're really cross about this. How can there's a war on in Russia, Ukraine, we're trying to arm the Ukrainians. What's going on? Friends of Grant Shapps got in touch with me, and they've made very clear that the numbers in Red Book showing that fall of to 18.9 billion from 19.2 billion doesn't include Ukraine, stockpiles, nuclear in there for the next year. So it does include some things it did include. So there's some jiggery-pokery with numbers here, but on the face of it, 0.9% in real terms is not enough given there's a war on in mainland Europe.
It doesn't even swallow inflation. Chris, stick with us, but first I'd like to move on and speak with the defence analyst and the former British Army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. Welcome to the show. It's always a pleasure. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of Exchequer there, promising down the line we would aspire to more defence, but it seems astonishing to people when we're facing perhaps an increased war effort in Europe with Ukraine and Vladimir Putin, and let alone the rising threat in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels. The only nod towards defence yesterday was £1 million for a Muslim war memorial. Do you just pull your hair out that we just seem to take defence for granted?
Good afternoon, Martin. Well, thankfully, I've still got some hair left to pull out. But no, I think that the interesting thing is that there is a major war, as everybody knows, going on in Europe. And Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, is fighting our proxy war against Russia. In fact, you could argue that Britain's front line is on the eastern Ukrainian border. Most other countries in Europe are upping their defence spending and reorganising and increasing their defence forces. And yet, in yesterday's budget, as you pointed out so rightly, there has been a small decline. Now, the MOD tried to spin this by saying, well, of course, it doesn't include the money going to the Ukraine. It shouldn't include the money going to the Ukraine. The Ukraine money that we send in terms of weapons and other material support should come out of the Treasury. And our defence budget should be for rebuilding our armed forces into some sort of shape where they are credible again for conventional warfare in Europe.
Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, Christopher Hope here in the studio. Do you think we'll ever get 2.5% of our GDP being spent on defence? And if so, when?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't look like it because the government has other priorities. But I tell you what, the minute that drones and start crossing the Channel and tackling the mainland UK, if they ever do, and the minute that Russian or even perhaps Chinese submarines begin interrupting our sea lanes, then I think you'll see a very rapid increase of defence spending to 2.5% and beyond. Personally, I think it needs to go up to at least 3% of GDP. And I know the government will have huge difficulty in finding that sort of uplift in money. But what is the existential crisis facing the UK at the moment? It's the prospect of renewed global war in Europe. And going to war is a come-as-you-are party. You don't go with what you want to go with. You go with what you've got at the time. And at the moment, we don't have enough stuff.
And Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, Isn't this a case of priorities? I mean, we have a ragbag army, the smallest army, in fact, since Napoleonic times. We have the smallest RAF since it was formed at the end of World War I. So few sailors, we're decommissioning ships. And yet we seem obsessed with pronouns and LGBTQ initiatives. Vladimir Putin must be laughing at us.
Well, I mean, I think he'll think that we've lost our senses, to be honest. And, I've got to be careful because I'm one of the old and bold that served in the 80s and 90s. But I and my former comrade at arms are really aghast at what has happened to the armed services as a whole, and the army in particular, in which we served since the beginning of this century. And I don't think that Putin has anything to fear in terms of the mass from British Army. It's perfectly formed and very small and wouldn't last very long in general war.
And Lieutenant Colonel Crawford, if Grant Shapps were here in the studio, what would you tell him now? What would you be saying to him? Do you think he's got the necessary gumption in Whitehall to fight for the extra money?
Well, he hasn't proved that to be the case yet. One of the things that really surprised me about Grant Shapps was his declaration on some other programme, I can't remember which one it was, that Britain had a sort of 1,700 kilometre sort of buffer zone between Russia and our shores. And in terms of land operations, that's probably correct. But he seems to forget that Russia has a very capable naval presence, including submarines. It has a very capable air presence, and it also has a very capable presence in space. So we are on the front line. The only place that we're not on the front line is on land operations.
OK, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford, thank you very much for joining us, giving your expert's opinion. And also thank you to you, Chris Hope. And of course, you can catch Chris Hope's full interview with the Chancellor of Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, on GB News' YouTube channel.